Charles W. Morse was born and raised in Bath, Maine. His father ran a successful marine towing business along the Kennebec River, which he was already heavily involved with before graduating from college, during which time he spearheaded their expansion into shipping lumber and ice. In a world before refrigeration, his recognition of the potential of the ice trade as a profitable venture proved highly lucrative. As business boomed, Morse began aggressively acquiring his competitors en masse. His end goal was a total monopoly, from the harvesting and shipping through the sales and distribution, and his eye was on New York City. According to the New York Times, while New Yorkers clearly loved their ice, Manhattan and Brooklyn consumed 1.3 million tons of ice in 1879, more than a quarter of the national market. They loathed the companies that provided it, and in the 1880s and 1890s, a rising chorus of critics charged these firms with price gouging and monopolistic practices. Their outrage was towards Charles Morse. In 1896, he bought out his last major competitor. He now had control of roughly 4 million tons of the region's ice harvests each year. That summer, New York was hit with a deadly heat wave. The city's poorest residents, living in overcrowded tenement housing with no air conditioning or running water, were hit the hardest, and some 1,500 people died over the 10-day calefaction. Morse turned tragedy into profits, further expanding his ice empire. In 1899, he bought out the few remaining holdouts and merged all of his holdings into the American Ice Company, widely known as the Ice Trust. Now, Morse had complete control of all natural and plant ice supplies and distribution along the eastern seaboard. Morse attempted to use his absolute dominance in the ice trade to fix prices. The plan failed miserably when the scheme was revealed by journalists. Reporting showed how Morse and his ice trust received special privileges from New York's corrupt Tammany Hall political sphere. In exchange, Robert Van Wyck, New York's first mayor after the unification of the 5 boroughs, and Richard Crocker, the ringleader of Tammany Hall, were given or sold shares of the Ice Trust at a substantial discount. Tammany Hall was a political organization that had control of the docks, the dock workers, and the dock workers' votes. As a result of Morse's bribery, the only ice that was allowed to be unloaded on the New York City wharves was Morse's ice brought in on his ships. Outrage ensued, and though his reputation was damaged, he exited the ice business with years of profit in hand and $12 million from the mandated sell-off of his ice trust operations. Morse's ambitions knew no bounds. Starting in 1901, he put his wealth into monopolizing the steamship industry along the Atlantic coast. Over the next 10 years, he purchased and consolidated enough steamship companies to effectively control travel and shipping from Cuba to Canada. A month after the Panic of 1907, the Wall Street Journal wrote, "He cast his eye up and down the North Atlantic coast, where already his fleet of 60 sailing vessels was plying. He knew the conditions of coastwise shipping, and he saw a chance to group all its fleets under one flag, and that flag would be his own. He would be Admiral of the North Atlantic Seas, but all this required money and credit, so he set about building up his banking system. He had become vice president and director in 12 banks and trust companies. As one of the richest men in New York, it didn't take long before he took control of the New Amsterdam National Bank, the National Bank of North America, and owned a substantial share of the Mercantile National Bank. The Ice King was now also the Admiral of the Atlantic coast, but in 1907, his empire would come crashing down like a house of cards. Morse's steamship and banking operations grew in a clever but perilously symbiotic fashion. The Wall Street Journal exposed his scheme in an article titled "Recent Lessons in Pyramidal Banking That Brought the Crisis," written in November of 1907. He bought the control of the stock in one bank. This made him a director, or, as it sometimes happened, both vice president and director. Then he took this stock and used it as collateral to borrow money to buy the control of another bank, and so on. He might have continued the process indefinitely. In doing so, Morse not only held a majority stake in multiple financial institutions and direct access to credit for use at his disposal, but he also tied together the financial solvency of the banks. Wealth travels in small circles, so it wasn't long after returning to New York, flush with ambition and the $12 million he pulled from Standard Oil, that F. Augustus Heinze, the Copper King, became acquainted with Charles W. Morse, the Ice King. Their shared appetite for power and willingness to push against and pass the bounds of the law made them quick friends. Heinze had only a few small banking interests in Montana previously, but Morse's scheme held the promise of great wealth and opportunity for becoming a major player in New York's financial circles.
While Heinze had been successful in his endeavors in the mining industry in Montana, he had done well, he had cashed out. He wanted to come to New York and be a banker. And through his network of connections, through his brothers and others, he met Charles Morse. And it was because of that that led him on a new path in the world of high finance in New York City at the turn of the last century.
Through Morse's influence, Heinze used a portion of his buyout money from Amalgamated to purchase the Mercantile National Bank, becoming its president in February 1907. Thereafter, Heinze joined Morse as a director in a chain of other financial institutions that included at least 6 national banks, 10 to 12 state banks, 5 or 6 trust companies, and 4 insurance concerns. Despite selling his Montana mining interests to the Rockefellers' Amalgamated Copper, Heinze still maintained ownership of mining operations in several other states. He consolidated them into his previously established holding company, United Copper. The main office was directly across the hall from his brother's brokerage firm, Otto C. Heinze and Company. Bruner and Carr go on to say, using Otto C. Heinze and Company as their primary agent on Wall Street, the Heinze brothers then entered into a stock pool with Charles W. Morse. As money rates tightened and as equity prices fell broadly, the brothers became concerned about their holdings in United Copper, whose stock had been used to secure their positions in numerous banking concerns. In an attempt to support the price of their United Copper Company shares, the Heinzes began purchasing large quantities of the company's stock. They paid for most of these purchases by borrowing money from brokers, in a method called buying on margin. Just like their banking pyramid, the stocks, at their borrowed value, were collateral for the loans they took out, with as many as 20 brokerages owing some $2 million.
So as Augustus Heinze had joined his brothers in New York, one of whom became head of a stock trading house, they believed that the stock that they had offered up as collateral for their own margin calls, well, that stock had been secretly lent out yet again, because they noticed that there were far more stocks reported in the market than were in truth ever created. And so they thought that the stock must be being shorted at that point.
After auditing United Copper Company shares, Otto determined that there was as many as 25,000 shares being sold short. He believed that their pool owned a majority of the stock, and that if they purchased the remaining stock available and then called in all shares loaned out, they could profit greatly, as the short sellers were forced to buy back the shares they had borrowed at a higher price, in what is called a short squeeze. Fearing that his creditors would call in his loans and ruin his brokerage business, Otto attempted the squeeze on his own, despite Morse and his brother's opposition to the squeeze on the grounds that the pool didn't have a strong enough position. As if foretold, the corner failed miserably as Morse's and F. Augustus's concerns were realized. Short sellers found ample sellers outside of the United Copper pool to cover their positions, and then promptly stopped trading the stock. The price dropped from a high of around $62.50 a share to a sickening low of $10 a share just 3 days later on October 16th. Otto was ruined, and on the 17th, the brokerage of Otto C. Heinze and Company was suspended from the New York Stock Exchange. The Wall Street Journal reported that a long line of brokers formed demanding payment. Some of the brokers, after waiting several hours, shoved the accounts with certificates over the ransom of the Heinze office, while others kicked at the doors and sought for recognition, which was not forthcoming. The jig was up. Several months earlier, F. Augustus Heinze's bank, the Mercantile National, was hit with a silent run, during which time depositors withdrew some $4 million. After news of the Heinze brothers' corner was made public, so too was the news of the run. Panic spread like wildfire, and a new run began. The same day after Otto's brokerage was suspended from the New York Stock Exchange, the Mercantile National's gross deposits fell 42%. The next day, the State Savings Bank of Butte, Montana, one of Heinze's few banking concerns outside of New York, declared its insolvency, and he was ousted from his seat as president of the Mercantile National. In short order, every institution connected to the two rogue kings was hit fast and hard as trust, the only glue holding the banking industry together at the time, was lost. In an attempt to avert a complete meltdown, the New York Clearing House snapped into action, lending aid to its imperiled member banks only after assessing their solvency. 3 days later, the New York Clearing House removed Augustus and Morse from their banking interests in New York City, and they were ordered to repay any outstanding loans they held with those banks. Some 50 years earlier, many New York City banks had joined together to form the New York Clearing House Association, which served to simplify and streamline the settlement of clearing balances between banks. It functioned in some ways like a central bank. In times of financial upheaval, the clearinghouse would pool resources to cover deposits and debts.
The number of banks up until that time were growing at a rate faster than population growth. The number of new banks were growing at a rate faster than GDP. It was astounding. There were only banks chartered at the national level. State banks were entirely separate. There was no interstate banking. That's important because it meant that there was very little visibility into all of these different state-level banks and below. That meant that this was a system that was very diverse, very complex, and very difficult to see into. So as these events emerged in October of 1907, that we see that it was difficult for other members of the financial community, investors, and depositors to truly understand what was going on. And because of that lack of transparency, it increased anxieties and led people to ultimately panic.
The worst was far from over, and the interconnected nature of the relationships among the nation's financial institutions would only enable the contagion to spread. The most significant casualty of the panic was the Knickerbocker Trust Company, a revered institution, one of the 3 oldest banks in New York. In 1907, its president, Charles T. Barney, had become a director of at least 33 corporations and was one of the founders of the New York subway system. His social and business associations with Charles Morse and his alleged participation in the United Copper Pool came into question. In an attempt to cool down the situation, the directors of the Knickerbocker asked Barney to tender his resignation. But on the same day, the clearinghouse that the Knickerbocker was a member of declined to give it aid. The run surged. Within just 2.5 hours, the Knickerbocker doled out $8 million to depositors across 4 locations and failed by the middle of the day. Its collapse sent shockwaves through the financial world, amplifying the panic and further impacting the stock market. In the weeks following the panic, the headlines were filled with stories about Charles T. Barney, the ousted president of the Knickerbocker Trust Company. During his time at the helm of the Knickerbocker, the company's total deposits rose from $11 million to over $65 million. Despite that, his previously pristine reputation was thoroughly run through the coals, with some of the most damning allegations coming from close business associates. He died less than a month later from a self-inflicted gunshot. Bernard Baruch, esteemed speculator and statesman of the time, wrote in his autobiography, In October, the Knickerbocker Trust Company closed, and its president killed himself. This precipitated a run on the New York banks such as the city had never seen within my memory. The panic spread to the floor of the stock exchange. The credit structure of the country collapsed. We found ourselves in the worst financial emergency since the crisis that followed the readjustment after the Civil War.